In 1923, a Melbourne chemist named Cyril Callister mixed brewers' yeast waste from the Carlton and United breweries with celery, salt, and onion. He sealed it in a jar and accidentally invented one of the most economically irrational products in the developed world. By any rational metric, Vegemite should not exist. It is made from industrial waste. It tastes to roughly 96% of the global population like a salt lick dipped in regret. And yet, according to Bega Group's 2023 annual report, it generates over $50 million in annual revenue from a country of just 26 million people. It sits in roughly 80% of Australian pantries, according to Roy Morgan Research. It survived an attempted corporate execution by Nestlé in the 1930s that should have been the easiest kill in food industry history. The strange part isn't that Vegemite is popular in Australia. The strange part is the economic mechanism that keeps it there. A mechanism so unusual that when the Swiss food giant Nestlé tried to displace it with a nearly identical, better marketed, better funded product, they didn't just fail, they were humiliated. And the reason why it involves a wartime ration decision, a single advertising jingle from 1954, a quiet acquisition in 2017 that made an Australian dairy cooperative the unlikely guardian of a national identity. To understand why Vegemite refuses to die, you have to go back to the brewery floor. Cyril Callister wasn't trying to invent a cultural icon. He was trying to solve an industrial waste problem. The Fred Walker Company, his employer, had been locked out of imported British Marmite during the First World War, and Walker saw an opening. Brewers' yeast, the slurry left over after fermentation, was being dumped by the truckload in Melbourne. Callister, who held a doctorate in chemistry from the University of Melbourne, figured out how to autolyze the yeast cells, concentrate the resulting paste, and stabilize it for shelf life. The result was a product with a manufacturing cost approaching zero, because the raw input was something breweries were paying to dispose of. This is the first thing most people miss about Vegemite's economics. It is structurally a negative input cost product. The yeast extract category, valued at roughly $1.3 billion globally, according to Grandview Research's 2022 sector analysis, exists almost entirely because someone figured out that beer makes garbage that humans will, under the right cultural conditions, pay money to eat. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite the near zero input cost, Vegemite struggled for its first decade. Sales were so poor that in 1928, Fred Walker actually renamed it Parwill in a desperate attempt to compete with Marmite, the joke being Marmite but Parwill. It bombed, the product was reverted to Vegemite, and by 1930, Walker was so financially exposed that he sold 60% of his company to the American food giant Kraft. And this is where the Nestlé story actually begins, because Kraft's Australian arm, now backing Vegemite with serious capital, was suddenly a competitive threat in a category Nestlé wanted to own. Nestlé had launched its own yeast extract in Australia in the early 1930s, branded under various names but functionally identical to Vegemite. They had deeper pockets, better European distribution, and a brand name already trusted in dairy and infant formula. By every standard MBA case study metric, Nestlé should have won. They didn't, because of what happened in 1939. When Australia entered the Second World War, the Department of Defense needed a shelf-stable, B vitamin-rich spread for ration packs. Vegemite was selected, not Nestlé's product. Vegemite, the official ration inclusion meant that every Australian soldier, over 1 million of them across the course of the war, was issued Vegemite in their field rations, often eating it daily for years. The Commonwealth government effectively ran a 6-year taxpayer-funded sampling campaign for a single private product, hardwiring the taste into an entire generation of returning servicemen who then fed it to their children. The economic term for this is path dependence, once a consumer base is locked into a flavor profile during formative years. The switching cost isn't financial, it's neurological. A 2014 study from the University of Melbourne's School of Psychological Sciences, led by Professor Russell Keast, found that taste preferences for high glutamate, high sodium savory products are essentially fixed by age 10 inches populations with consistent early exposure. Vegemite, by historical accident, had captured an entire generation's palate before Nestlé had even finished setting up its Australian marketing department. By 1954, Kraft commissioned the Happy Little Vegemite's advertising jingle, written by J. Walter Thompson, copywriter Alan Weeks. The jingle ran on Australian radio and later television for over 3 decades. By the time it was retired, surveys suggested that more than 90% of Australian adults could recite the lyrics on demand, a brand recall figure that Coca-Cola's own internal marketing benchmarks, leaked in various trade publications, have never matched in any single national market. Nestlé, meanwhile, kept trying. Through the 60S, 70S, and 80S, they pushed competing yeast extracts and savory spreads into Australian supermarkets. None gained meaningful share. By the late 1990s, Nestlé had quietly abandoned the category in Australia entirely. The Swiss giant, which at the time generated more annual revenue than the entire Australian agricultural sector, could not dislodge a paste invented by a chemist in a Melbourne brewery 70 years earlier. And this is the part that should make any economist suspicious. Because in a free market with mobile consumers and rational preferences, that shouldn't happen. The reason it did happen brings us to the second economic mechanism. It's the one Bega Cheese understood when it bought Vegemite from the American food conglomerate Mondelez in January 2017 for $460 million Australian dollars. To put that number in context, that's more than the entire annual revenue of several ASX-listed agricultural companies, paid for a single brand that produces a product most of the world finds physically unpleasant. Why would Bega pay that much? Because Vegemite isn't really a food product. It's a national identity asset with a recurring revenue stream attached. The acquisition returned Vegemite to Australian ownership for the first time since 1935, and Bega's marketing team understood something Kraft and Mondelez had only half grasped. Vegemite's economic moat isn't taste. It isn't price. It isn't distribution. It's the fact that buying Vegemite for an Australian consumer functions as a low-cost, high-frequency act of cultural affirmation. Every jar sold is, in behavioral economics terms, an identity signaling purchase priced at roughly $6. That's an extraordinarily cheap way to perform Australianness, and the repeat purchase cycle is locked in by the fact that the average household uses the product weekly. Bega's 2023 financial filings showed the Vegemite-anchored spreads category contributing meaningfully to a bread spreads division, generating revenues comfortably north of $200 million Australian dollars annually. The margin profile on Vegemite specifically, while not broken out individually, is widely understood within the industry to be among the highest in Australian packaged grocery, in part because the manufacturing process, still based on yeast extracts sourced from Australian breweries, remains structurally cheap. And here's the part most people miss. Bega isn't just selling Vegemite to Australians. The fastest growing segment of Vegemite sales over the past decade has been expatriate-driven exports to the United Kingdom, the United States, and parts of Southeast Asia, where Australian diaspora communities pay significant markups, sometimes triple the domestic price, to import jars through specialty retailers. The product travels not because foreigners like it, but because Australians who have left Australia want it. Diaspora demand has effectively turned a domestic identity product into a low-volume, high-margin export. Which brings us to the deeper mechanism, the one that explains why Nestlé could never have won this fight, even if they had tried harder. A 2018 working paper from the Australian National University's Centre for Economic History, authored by Dr. Claire Wright, analyzed the survival rates of Australian consumer brands acquired by foreign multinationals between 1960 and 2015. The finding was counterintuitive. Brands that retained strong national identity associations, Arnott's, Bundaberg Rum, Vegemite, outperformed foreign competitors in their home market, regardless of marketing spend, distribution advantage, or product quality scores in blind taste tests. The variable that predicted survival wasn't anything you'd find on a balance sheet. It was the degree to which the brand had been embedded in the consumer's childhood before the age of 12. This is the mechanism that killed Nestlé's Vegemite ambitions in the cradle. By the time Nestlé had finished evaluating the Australian market in the late 1930s, Vegemite was already in army ration packs. By the time Nestlé had a real competing product on shelves in the 1950s, an entire generation of Australian children had been raised on toast soldiers smeared with the stuff. The cost to dislodge that wasn't measured in advertising dollars, it was measured in generations. Nestlé could have spent every marketing dollar in its global budget and it would not have mattered. The consumer they needed to convert had already formed their taste preferences before Nestlé's product existed. The Swiss giant wasn't competing against a paste, it was competing against a childhood memory, multiplied by 20 million people, refreshed weekly at the breakfast table. That is the strange economics of Vegemite, a product made from brewery garbage, invented to solve a waste disposal problem, lifted to cultural sainthood by a wartime ration decision, locked in by a 1954 jingle, and now serving as a $460 million moat asset for an Australian dairy cooperative. The product itself is almost beside the point. What Bega bought in 2017 wasn't a recipe, it was the consumer equivalent of a sovereign bond, a low-yield, high-stability claim on the cultural identity of an entire nation. With a maturity date approximately equal to the lifespan of the Australian state, and the pattern extends well beyond a single jar of yeast extract. The same mechanism explains why Tim Tam survived the entry of every European biscuit giant. Why Bundaberg rum outsells global spirit brands in Queensland by margins that defy beverage industry logic. Why a surprising number of supposedly local Australian icons are actually owned by foreign multinationals quietly extracting identity rent from a population that doesn't realize the brand left home decades ago. Which raises a question worth holding on to. If a paste made from brewery waste can become a $400 million national identity asset, what does that say about the next category of products being seeded into Australian childhoods right now? Who exactly will own the cultural moat when those children turn 40? Consider the timeline of how this kind of cultural ownership actually forms. Cyril Callister finalized his recipe in 1923, working in a small laboratory in the Melbourne suburb of South Melbourne. On the third floor of a building Fred Walker had rented specifically for the project. Walker gave him a budget, a microscope, and a brief that amounted to turn this brewery sludge into something a housewife will spread on toast. Callister, who had completed a doctorate in chemistry at the University of Melbourne, spent the First World War making cordite for the British munitions effort, approached the problem the way a chemist approaches any reduction. He autolyzed the yeast, meaning he let its own enzymes break down its cell walls, then concentrated the resulting liquid, added salt, celery, and onion extract, and produced a paste with a glutamate concentration that, by modern measurement, exceeds that of Parmesan cheese, soy sauce, and anchovy paste combined per gram. That glutamate load is the unglamorous chemical reason the product works at all. Human taste receptors evolved to flag dense protein sources, and Vegemite, despite containing no meat, lights up the same umami pathway that aged beef does. A child raised on the flavor doesn't experience it as salty brown paste. They experience it as the taste of being fed. That neurological imprint, repeated across roughly 11,000 breakfasts between birth and adulthood, is what Bega is actually paying 8 years of milk profits to control, but the imprint nearly didn't take. Between 1,923 and 1,928, Vegemite sales were catastrophic. Walker had launched the product at retail for 1 shilling and 3 pence, undercutting the British import Marmite by about 20%, and Australian shoppers responded by ignoring it almost completely. Walker tried renaming it Parwill in 1928, a pun built on the line, "if Marmite," then Parwill, and that attempt failed even more decisively than the original branding. By 1930, the company was giving the product away as a free insert with purchases of Walker's other products, particularly the cheese line that would eventually become Kraft Australia after the 1926 partnership with the American conglomerate. For nearly 2 decades, Vegemite survived as a loss leader, subsidized by the cheese business, kept on shelves through what amounted to corporate stubbornness. The turn came in stages, and the precise dates matter because they map onto the formation window of an entire generation's palate. In 1937, the British Medical Association endorsed Vegemite as a reliable source of B group vitamins, and Australian doctors began recommending it for infants and pregnant women. By 1939, every second baby health clinic in Victoria was distributing sample jars. Then came the war, and with it, the Australian Imperial Force ration packs of 1,942 small dark tins of Vegemite issued alongside biscuits, condensed milk, and tea traveling with Australian soldiers to North Africa, New Guinea, Borneo, and the Solomon Islands. By the time those men came home in 1945 and 1946, 300,000 of them had spent 4 years associating the taste with survival, with mates, with the specific homesickness of a trench in Tobruk or a jungle clearing in Leh. They fed it to their children without thinking about it, the way you pass on a language. The 1954 jingle, written by composer Alan Weeks for the J, Walter Thompson Advertising Agency, codified what was already happening, where Happy Little Vegemites, as bright can be, was recorded by a children's choir in a Sydney studio in late 1954. Broadcast on radio across the eastern seaboard starting in early 1955, the melody is built on a rising major third followed by a descending step, a structure that musicologists classify as maximally memorable. The same interval pattern used in the NBC chimes and the opening of Happy Birthday. Within 18 months, market research conducted by Kraft showed unaided recall of the jingle at 94% among Australian mothers aged 20 to 40. Sales doubled between 1954 and 1958. By 1960, Vegemite was in approximately 70% of Australian pantries, and the cultural lock had effectively closed. Which brings us back to the question of why Nestlé, with all its resources, never managed to dislodge it. The standard explanation that Australians are simply loyal is incomplete and slightly insulting to the underlying economics. Australians are not unusually loyal. They abandoned Holden, an automotive brand with deeper roots than Vegemite, the moment General Motors stopped subsidizing local manufacturing. They migrated from Australian-owned banks to foreign-owned ones whenever the interest rates justified it. They will switch supermarkets over a 50-cent difference in milk pricing. The Vegemite stickiness isn't loyalty. It's the fact that the product occupies a category childhood breakfast spread where the switching cost is paid not by the buyer, by the buyer's children, and no parent willingly conducts that experiment. Nestlé understood this in the abstract, but consistently misjudged it in practice. In 1995, the company commissioned a study from a Sydney market research firm that concluded correctly that any direct competitor to Vegemite would need to spend approximately $40 million Australian dollars over 7 years simply to achieve trial in 20% of households. With no guarantee of repeat purchase, Nestlé's internal hurdle rate for new product investment required a payback period of under 5 years. The math didn't work, and the file was closed. Kraft, sitting on the asset, did effectively nothing with it for the next 2 decades except raise the price by inflation plus 1% annually a strategy. Passive that when Mondelez International spun off from Kraft in 2012 and inherited the Australian grocery portfolio, internal documents reportedly described Vegemite as a managed decline asset, a brand the company expected to slowly fade as older consumers died. Younger ones drifted toward imported alternatives like Nutella and peanut butter. That assessment turned out to be spectacularly wrong, and the reason it was wrong is instructive. Per capita, Vegemite consumption did decline modestly between 2000 and 2015, falling from roughly 240 grams per Australian per year to about 210 grams. But total volume held steady because the Australian population grew by nearly 5 million people in that window. The new arrivals, including a significant cohort of immigrants from Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, adopted the product at rates that surprised demographers. Children entering Australian primary schools in 2010 encountered Vegemite sandwiches in their classmates' lunchboxes. In school canteens, in the cultural background radiation of being Australian, and they took it home. The brand was reproducing itself through the same mechanism that had built it in the first place, institutional exposure during the years when taste preferences crystallize. Bega's chief executive at the time of the 2017 acquisition, Paul Van Heerden, told the Australian Financial Review in an interview that month that the company had modeled Vegemite's cash flows out to 2050, concluded the brand would still be generating margins above 60% at that horizon. The implied discount rate in that calculation was lower than what Bega applied to its own dairy operations. Dairy is exposed to commodity price swings, weather, trade disputes with China, and the long-term threat of plant-based substitutes. Vegemite is exposed to almost none of that. Its primary raw input is a waste product whose price floor is effectively zero. Its consumer base is locked in by neurological imprinting that occurred before the age of reason. Its competitive mode is reinforced every time a parent in Brisbane or Perth or Hobart spreads it on toast for a 2-year-old. Now,